Hi and welcome back. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about what is software architecture because it's something I've been struggling to explain, and I haven't really seen a very good explanation for it. So let's have a look at this question. Just what is it? Now, if you look at the various textbooks, the definition of what is an architecture that's gaining a great deal of popularity is the one given in Bass, Clements and Casman's book, Software Architecture in Practice. It's more or less that the software architecture of a system consists of the structural elements of that system, their properties and the relationships among them, which is true. That's what it is when you look at the architecture. But and the other definitions given there, it comes out of Standard 42010, which is written. It's an international standard on software architecture descriptions, documenting software architectures, developed by a collection of fairly experienced software architects. Their definition is that it's the fundamental organization of a system embodied in its components, their relationships to each other and to the environment, and the principles guiding its design and evolution, which again is a fairly accurate description of an architecture. But the problem I have with both of these is that these descriptions make sense only after the event. You could look at a completed architecture, or you could look at an architecture and apply that description and recognize that yes, this is an architecture. But the problem I have is that it says nothing about how to make an architecture when you haven't got one. It says nothing about why this architecture exists or what it is you're trying to achieve. So this bugged me a lot because I was trying to find some good way of describing what actually is an architecture and what is not an architecture. And I kept looking out of my office window, or I look across the road to what has been a construction site. There is a building there now, and there's also a big hole in the ground in front of it. So I'm looking at this big building, which is a residential block, and I'm thinking, well, what is architectural about it? What is going on? And all sorts of other buildings, all different types of buildings. So why is the architecture of a hospital different to the architecture of a hotel, which is different from the architecture of a university, which is different from the architecture of a stadium? What is the difference? What makes the difference? And eventually I had to conclude that what makes the difference is what the architecture is there for. The architecture is there to enable and support the activities within it. Okay? Now this is one of those threshold concepts that once you've got hold of the idea, nothing looks the same anymore. Now the architecture itself doesn't make any sense in the absence of those things that are going to happen that the architecture is going to enable and support. So for a residential block, you have things like, well, people want to live there, they want to cook there, they want to sleep there, they want to get in and out of the building, but they don't want to play football in it. All right. So how does that architecture permit people to get in and out of the building, to live there in harmony, to sleep there in peace, to cook there as when they will? I mean, you have to have plumbing to bring in the water, the electricity supply, the gas supply, the sewage drainage. The lifts have to be there. That's if, assuming it's more than about 6 floors, because years ago when they didn't have lifts, you walked up the stairs, and the maximum height of the building was about 6 floors, because that's about as much as anybody could walk up. So there's all these activities going on. Okay, so that kind of determines what the architecture is. Now, that means because there's no large gatherings, you don't need a large room, you don't need a lecture hall. That's not what a residential building's about. It's also, you don't have room to back up an ambulance. This is not a hospital. But in a hospital, the activities are things like getting the patients in, getting the patients out, and carrying on. So the architecture is not separate from the activities that it will support. Now the same goes for software systems. It is a software system, but what are the activities? The activity is the movement of information and control about the system in order to achieve something. And you have to consider what is the information moving about? Why are the movements? What are the movements doing? Who's controlling it? Who needs to get access to it? And all of these activities is what the architecture supports. So that, to me, is a much better definition of what the architecture is, as being something that supports the required activities of the system. So having said that, now we'll look at the breakdown of the definition in terms of its structural elements and the relationships between them. So we have there the structural elements. We are concerned about the abstractions, not each and every individual element, not every object. We're interested in the classes and the relationships among the classes. We also have to note that architecture exists at different levels of abstraction. So we talk about the architecture in terms of the packages, and then we break it down to the components within the packages. And we can talk about the architecture of all of the components. Then we can talk about architecture of classes within the components and break it down even further. So there are multiple levels of abstractions, and we can talk about either an architecture as being the collection of the whole thing, or we can talk about the architecture of each individual thing. Now, classically in software architecture, we are dealing with all of those abstractions. We are dealing with the collective set of architectures. Now, the difference between an architecture and a design can be a matter of scale. We typically don't talk about the architecture of a program, but I would guess that would depend a great deal on the size of your program and just exactly what you're doing. The division of a program into, well, certainly in procedural code, the division of a program into routines and subroutines certainly has elements of architectural division within it. But division of a program, division of a single class in terms of its methods, probably doesn't make that much sense. Nevertheless, what is and is not an architecture usually is kind of a matter of scale. So we could talk about the architecture of a building in terms of the walls, the lifts, the space, the power supply, the water supply, the air conditioning, the sewage, how do you get things in and out of the building. And but more importantly, they are the services. More importantly, the major structural elements of the building support and enable the activities within the building. Now, importantly for software architectures, that also must consider the possible, if not probable, evolution of the system as the system changes over time. That becomes part of the architecture. This is going to be a necessary part of it. So all up, we have a definition of an architecture, and my contention that the classic definitions of an architecture are very static and don't tell you much about the architecture at all. It's kind of like a definition. You could look at it and say, yeah, it qualifies. So what? There's not a good criteria with which to say, well, is this a suitable architecture, or is it a good architecture, or does it serve its purpose? I much prefer the definition of the structural elements, their attributes, and the relationships among them that enables and supports the activities of the system.